Chernobyl, comrades. An otherwise innocuous name now cemented in infamy, as it's impossible to mention Chernobyl without most people remembering, oh right, horrific radiation zone. And indeed, Chernobyl remains to this day the worst nuclear disaster in history, as well as the most expensive disaster in history, with an estimated total cost of everything they had to do to be about $700 billion US. So yeah, this was not good for so many reasons. But the thing about Chernobyl is that because it's so infamous, because people know, or think they know, what happened and how it happened and all the ins and outs and the current status and everything, well, there's a lot of misinformation. Like, a disgusting, stupid amount of misinformation about Chernobyl. It was very bad. Don't get me wrong. But in terms of how it happened, as well as the repercussions and a whole bunch of stories surrounding the disaster, there's a lot of lies. Many lies, which have only been continuously perpetuated through media. Doubtless many of you have seen HBO's miniseries on the disaster.
You didn't! Because it's not there!
And from a cinematography and acting perspective, I thought it was brilliant. However, there were so many things wrong in that miniseries. And I hate to say that because otherwise, I thought it was really good, but man, they just couldn't get the facts right. And I mean like basic how the disaster even happened facts. But I digress. I'm here to give you facts. That is what I do. So let's discuss the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was originally called the Chernobyl nuclear power plant of V.I. Lenin, after, yes, that Lenin, because Soviet Union, comrades, was initially planned to be absolutely massive, much larger than it became. Construction on the plant began in 1972, and they were meant to have 12 reactors. But construction was staggered in 6 different phases. They didn't just build all of it at once. And prior to the disaster, they had only worked things up to have a total of 4 reactors, which were RBMK 1000s, each providing 1,000 megawatts of electric power. And even with just 4, that provided roughly 10% of Ukraine's total electricity, so it was a lot of energy for a single plant. The final version of Chernobyl, had it got that far, would have been the largest nuclear power plant in the world. But for reasons I think are abundantly clear even prior to me telling you what happened, further construction was halted because, no, Chernobyl was also the 3rd Soviet RBMK nuclear plant, and the first plant on Ukrainian soil. Reactor 1 was finished in 1977, number 2 in 78, number 3 in 81, and number 4, the problem child, in 83. But we're going to jump ahead to April 26, 1986. Well, sometime before that, because while the actual explosion happened on that date, the events leading up to it, well, obviously happened before. Reactor number 4 was being tested, believe it or not, safety tested, because there was a possible issue that they did see coming when it came to the design of the RBMK reactors. The issue in question involved the heat generated by nuclear fission, which is how the reactor produces the energy needed to heat the water, which produces steam, which produces a turbine, which produces electricity. The fission itself was normal, however, 6% of the total heat produced by the fission comes from radioactive decay, and that heat still is produced even after shutdown. Because of this, continued coolant circulation is needed to prevent the core from overheating, which would result in a meltdown, which is bad. The RBMK reactors used water as the coolant, and it was circulated through the reactor by electrically driven pumps. Number 4 had a total of 1,661 individual fuel channels, and it needed a lot of water to stay cool. 45 million liters, 12 million US gallons of coolant per hour to keep it from overheating. The concern was a total power loss, because again, radioactive decay heat, which still happens even if the reactor shuts off. Now, in the event that happened, they did have 3 backup diesel generators in order to keep the water flowing to make sure things didn't overheat. However, they required at least a minute to reach full load and generate the power needed to run a single pump. To compensate for this, there were counterweights on the pump that provided coolant via simple inertia, which bridged that gap, but there was the issue of what if there was a blackout at the same time as a rupture of a coolant pipe. In that situation, they would need the Emergency Core Cooling System, or ECCS, to pump additional water into the core. So they were testing a theory. It was thought that, perhaps, the rotational momentum of the steam turbine could still be generating enough power to operate the ECCS via the feed water pumps. This is because a steam turbine, well, it spins, and it doesn't necessarily stop dead when there's nothing making it spin. Just like a fidget spinner, it keeps spinning for a bit. Now, granted, this would only generate sufficient energy, based on the math they did, for about 45 seconds, but that was still considered enough where it would alleviate the situation substantially to not result in some kind of horrific catastrophe. So yes, they were doing this test to try to figure out if that was possible, meaning that they were trying to make things safer. Which, if it didn't result in a bunch of horrific deaths, would actually be hilarious. But that is what happened, so we're not gonna laugh about that. We are gonna call it deeply unsettlingly ironic, though. They needed to confirm that their math was correct, that this theory was correct, and the only way to do that was to actually test the reactor and all the attached systems under the circumstances that were proposed. They had already tried to test this before. An initial test was carried out all the way back in '82, but that test resulted in a failure. It showed that the excitation voltage of the turbine generator wasn't actually enough, so they had to modify the electrical system to see if they could correct this. They did another test in '84, but that also failed. '85, it was done a third time and also failed. But to be fair, in '85, that was because there was a problem with the recording equipment. They couldn't get accurate results. They didn't actually know if it worked. And once again, they were going to run the test procedure in '86, scheduled to take place during a controlled power down of Reactor 4, which would already be scheduled anyway as they planned to shut off the reactor for some maintenance. The procedure for the test had indeed been written down, as was appropriate, but the authors of the test didn't actually know exactly how the RBMK-1000 reactor behaved under the planned operating conditions. It was kind of generic in that way, meaning not everything on the instructions really made that much sense for an RBMK. It was only intended as a purely electrical test of the generator. And despite them messing about with a nuclear reactor, the existing Soviet regulations at the time meant that the test didn't actually require the approval by the chief design authority for the reactor, or the nuclear safety regulator. As part of the test, they were to disable the emergency core cooling system, and they did still need approval from the site chief engineer, but that had been obtained. The first thing they were to do was to reduce the reactor's thermal power between 700 megawatts and 1,000 megawatts. That would allow for adequate cooling. The steam turbine generator was to be run at normal operating speed during this, and 4 out of 8 main circulating pumps were to be supplied with off-site power. The other 4 would be powered by the turbine. Once they got to the appropriate conditions, the steam supply to the turbine generator would be shut off, and that would trigger an automatic reactor shutdown under ordinary conditions, which these weren't. The voltage provided by the coasting turbine would then be measured to see if it was enough to do what they wanted it to do in the case of an actual emergency, along with the voltage and the RPM of the 4 main circulating pumps that were still being powered by the turbine. And once the emergency generators supplied full electrical power, the turbine would be allowed to freewheel all the way down to a dead stop. I have made it sound pretty simple, but obviously it was a bit more complicated than that. but I think you have a general understanding as to how this went. The test was to be conducted during the day shift on April 25th, 1986. As I said, that was part of a scheduled reactor shutdown anyway, so it seemed a good time to do the test without, causing unnecessary interruptions to power supply. The day shift had already been instructed in advance on the reactor operating conditions to run the test, and they had a special team of electrical engineers present to conduct the electrical test once the correct conditions were reached. So they were ready and prepped to do this properly, and more importantly, safely. And they did begin prepping the reactor for the test. A gradual reduction in the output of the power unit began at 1:06 in the morning on April 25th. And by the beginning of day shift, things were down to just 50% power. The day shift had been scheduled to actually do the test at 14:15. They continued their preparatory work, which included disabling the emergency core cooling system. But there was a sudden hiccup in everything they had been planning to do. A separate power station, but a regional one, unexpectedly went offline. They had a problem, meaning the grid suddenly had a deficit that they weren't expecting. So at 1400, the Kiev electrical grid controller requested that Chernobyl not be reduced in power any further because they kind of needed it until they got the other plant back up and working. So they did. They didn't reduce the power any further, but the reactor continued running at the reduced setting it was already on. And the emergency core cooling system was left turned off. They didn't reinitiate it. The reason for this is the system had to be disconnected via a manual isolating slide valve, and it required 2 or 3 people to spend basically a whole shift manually turning sailboat helm-sized valve wheels, so they just didn't reconnect it. Now, to be fair, the ECCS had nothing to do with the disaster. Not at all. But, they still let the reactor run for 11 hours outside of the test without emergency protection, so it's like, guys, what are we doing here? That's a bit concerning, I'm just saying. I know it's a pain, but come on. By 2304, the Kiev grid controller allowed the reactor shutdown to resume. But the day shift had long since left, and second shift was preparing to leave, so the responsibility for the test fell upon night shift. Had things gone to plan, the test would have already been done during the day shift. That was what they intended. The night shift was only expecting to have to maintain decay heat cooling systems with a reactor that was otherwise turned off. They didn't actually expect it to be powered, let alone perform any kind of testing, but that's what they were going to do. Meaning that they had basically no time to prepare for or to carry out the experiment. A lot of sources suggest these guys were inept, but that's not really true. All of them were substantially qualified, some overqualified to handle an RBMK. They did know what they were doing. They were just put in a situation where anyone would struggle, even an expert. Anatoly Dyatlov, who's commonly portrayed as a complete moron, really wasn't. He actually was very professional, and it's not believed his portrayal of being a complete jerk to his staff is accurate whatsoever. He was the deputy chief engineer of the power plant, and he was present to help direct the test. He was in fact one of the chief authors of the test, and was also the highest ranking individual present. So, they did have an expert there. He just had to assist a staff that hadn't been appropriately briefed on what exactly they were supposed to do. The unit shift supervisor was Alexander Akimov, who was again very, very qualified to be handling a reactor, and he was in charge of the Unit 4's night shift in general. There was also Leonid Toptunov, who was the senior reactor control engineer, responsible for Unit 4's operational regimen, including, more specifically, the movement of the control rods. Toptunov was only 25 years old, but he had worked independently as a senior engineer for 3 months, and again, these guys were no slouches. They were very smart, highly knowledgeable, and knew how the reactor worked. They weren't underqualified, nor were they inept. But, again, the situation they were put in was not one they were overly familiar with, except perhaps Dyatlov. But remember, despite being an author of the test was meant to happen over a predicted span of time. It wasn't meant to occur while the reactor had been sitting at half power for 11 hours. This is super relevant because, well, the plan called for the gradual decrease in the power of the reactor to a thermal level of between 700 and 1,000 megawatts, as I mentioned. And by just 5 minutes after midnight on April 26, they did hit an output of 720 megawatts, so they were within their range. But because the reactor had sat for so long, just chilling at half power, not full power, or even close to that, the reactor had been producing a fission byproduct known as xenon-135. This is known, and it's normal. Xenon-135 is a reaction-inhibiting neutron absorber. It decreases reactivity substantially, and can choke and stall a nuclear reactor if too much is left inside. It's often called reactor poisoning. Under normal circumstances in a steady-state operation, full power, Xenon-135 isn't an issue because it's just burned off as quickly as it's created, changing to a more stable version, Xenon-136. But with the reduced power, a significant bulk of Xenon-135 had been created and not converted into 136, poisoning the absolute crap out of Reactor 4, and dragging the power output down without any operator input. Things were not going appropriately, but it wasn't exactly an emergency, it was just the reactor was poisoned. Once everything dropped to just 500 megawatts, the reactor power control was switched over to manual, so they could directly maintain the required power levels. AR1 was then pressed, which removed all 4 of the control rods associated with that. But due to an imbalance in the ionizing chambers, AR2 failed to activate. In order to compensate for this, Toptonov had to reduce power even further to stabilize the automatic regulator's ionization sensors. But because he had dropped power in an already poisoned reactor, it pushed the thing all the way down to near shutdown, with a power output of only 30 megawatts, practically nothing in this context. It's still debated exactly what caused the power drop to sink so low in this situation. A lot of reports blame Toptonov, but Dyatlov defended him, putting more blame on the faulty AR2 system. And it is factually true that system failed, so Toptonov doing what he did in that situation did make logical sense, even though the end result was less than ideal. By this point, the reactor was producing only 5% of the minimum initial power level prescribed for the test, not even close. And this was only making the situation worse, because remember, the reason why they were having difficulties is that the reactor was already poisoned because it had been operating at half power for 11 hours. They had to get the power back up somehow. To accomplish this, the control room personnel removed a whole bunch more control rods, which are there to inhibit the reactor, but in this situation there was already something doing that, so yeah, take out more control rods. They managed to get the power back up to 160 megawatts by 0039, and by that point the rod configuration wasn't in an unusual state. A lot of them were pulled out, but it was still within normal operating limits. It wasn't something that should have caused any problems, at least at that time. The operational reactivity margin, or ORM, dictated having more than 15 rods inserted. As they continued trying to fix the problem, over the following 20 minutes, they managed to push the reactor up to 200 megawatts, but that was still well below the test operational procedures. Again, they had to be at least 700. While the operators kept messing about with the control rods, the reactor was also dealing with unstable core temperatures, as well as the coolant flow being off. They did receive repeated emergency signals regarding the low levels in one half of the steam and water separator drums, as well as drum separator pressure warnings, and in response to that, they triggered rapid influxes of feed water. The relief valves opened to relieve excess steam into a turbine condenser. They couldn't really get it above 200 megawatts anymore. They were struggling with that, so it was decided to just conduct the test at that much lower level, despite them being short by a good 500 megawatts. As part of this, 2 additional main circulating pumps were activated at 105. But that increased the coolant flow, which is what it was supposed to do, but it lowered the overall core temperatures and reduced the existing steam voids in the core. Water absorbs neutrons better than steam, and as a result, that reduced reactivity. Again. To compensate, the operators removed even more of the manual control rods to maintain the power. At that point, the amount of control rods within the reactor was below the required standard of 15. And you might be saying, Darkness, you said that these guys knew what they were doing. They were well educated. How could they make a mistake like that? Well, that's because the RBMK didn't actually have any instruments capable of calculating the inserted rod worth in real time. They didn't know. You'd think they'd have a simple in or out circuit, something to tell them that, but no, don't be silly. That doesn't seem necessary. Why would we need to know how many control rods are in the nuclear reactor? What could possibly go wrong? Because of this, the reactor became increasingly unstable. The configuration was not standard whatsoever. The RBMK had not been designed for this. And by the time they were done messing about with the control rods, nearly all of them had been taken out of the core. That, combined with very high coolant flow rates, meaning the water didn't have time to cool off between trips through the core, resulting in entering the reactor again close to the boiling point, which kind of starting to defeat the purpose of coolant. And now is probably a good time to mention that the RBMK design had what is known as a positive void coefficient of reactivity. That was different from literally every other light water reactor design. A void coefficient is a number that can be used to estimate how much the reactivity of a nuclear reactor changes as voids form in the reactor moderator or coolant. Again, RBMK had a positive void coefficient, and that meant that the formation of steam bubbles, which in this context are the voids, from the boiling water, wound up intensifying the nuclear chain reaction, because the voids have lower neutron absorption than water. The operators knew about the positive void coefficient, but what they didn't know was that in the situation they had created, unintentionally, the void coefficient wasn't being counterbalanced by any other reactivity effects. So any increase in boiling would produce even more voids and increase reactivity, resulting in a positive feedback loop, which is bad. With all these circumstances in place, reactor number 4 was in a position to suffer a runaway cascade of reactivity. The power would increase in the core consistently, which is what they wanted, but they would have no way of containing it. There was nothing to hold it back anymore. And as the power increased, the xenon would be burnt off as they wanted, but the xenon was the only thing holding it in check for a while. At 1:23:04, the test officially began. 4 of the 8 main circulating pumps were to be powered by voltage from the coasting turbine, while the remaining 4 pumps received electrical power from the regular power grid. The steam to the turbines was cut off, beginning the rundown of the turbine. The diesel generators did start as planned, and should have picked up the main circulating pump's power needs by 1:23:43. As the momentum of the turbine went down, so did the power it was producing for the pumps, which, again, we already went over this. That was expected, but because of that, the water flow rate decreased, which you would expect. The pumps were operating more slowly. But that meant the flow through the core was slower, and that meant that there was increased formation of those steam voids. At 1:23:40, a scram of the reactor was initiated. That's an emergency shutdown, and in this context, it's the result of them pressing AZ5. It's a button on the control panel, and it's designed to engage the drive mechanism on every single control rod and fully shove them into the reactor, including the manual ones. This would reduce reactivity to a standstill, at least it should have. And despite how this is often portrayed, it's actually still unclear why they did this, because according to witnesses that survived, the atmosphere of the control room was calm, and the pressing of AZ5 was not after the power shot up like crazy, as is often portrayed. It was already planned to press it at some point in preparation for the scheduled maintenance that I mentioned earlier. They didn't do it as an actual emergency, they just did it to shut the reactor down. But the timing is still questionable. It's not sure why they did it that early. The decision to do this was made by both Akimov and Toptonov, who were never able to actually explain why, because they died very quickly after the accident. Regardless of the exact reason, we know it was pressed before the incredible increase in power. And that's because pressing AZ5 had actually caused the incredible increase in power. Now, you're probably pretty confused. Because, why? Why would that? They're the control rods. Aren't they supposed to reduce? And yes, they are. But in the situation that was created in that reactor at the time, they didn't actually work the way they expected. Had everything been normal, this would have shut down the reactor. But it wasn't. To begin with, AZ-5, while it did insert all the control rods, it didn't actually do that very fast. The RBMKs were designed in such a way where the control rods took at least 18 seconds to travel the full height of the core. The core was 23 feet tall, so yeah, they didn't actually move through it very quickly. So they entered this unstable reactor at a relatively slow pace, and that still probably wouldn't have been a major issue if not for the fact the control rods were designed in a bit of an interesting way. Some will tell you that their tips had graphite on them. That's not exactly correct. It wasn't the tips, though it was the ends. When the control rods were taken out of the reactor, they weren't all the way out. The graphite was still in there. And the reason the graphite was in there was to serve as a neutron moderator. That's what graphite does. It's a moderator. HBO told you that graphite accelerates a nuclear reaction. No, it doesn't. It absolutely does not. It's a moderator. It slows down fast neutrons so they can cause more fission reactions in uranium. I know that sounds like it would accelerate it, but it doesn't. It doesn't make it go any faster, it just makes it more stable, and allows for it to sustain itself in an appropriate manner. That's why the rods were designed that way, because when they were pulled out, you wanted the reaction to keep going appropriately, and the graphite helped with that. So no, the control rods didn't jam and leave the graphite endlessly accelerating the reaction. That is not how this happened whatsoever. What it did do, well, when a control rod in the RBMK was at maximum extraction, which is what most of them were before AZ-5 was pressed, the graphite extension was centered in the core with roughly 4.1 feet, 1.25 meters of water above and below them. This is relevant because when AZ-5 was pressed, all the rods were shoved into the core, pushing the graphite sections downward into the reactor, which did cause the power to rise. Why? Because the movement initially displaced the neutron-absorbing water in the lower portion of the reactor with the moderating graphite. This flaw was known about as early as 1983, but it wasn't thought that there would be any condition where that would really cause a problem. The spike in an appropriately operating reactor would either just not happen or be so negligible that it wasn't even worth it. But in the circumstances that were created in Reactor 4, basically every single thing that could cause this spike to be absolutely catastrophic were present. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. When the water was displaced, the runaway reaction began. Just a few seconds into the Scram, a power spike occurred, and the core began to overheat. This caused several of the rods to fracture. They weren't stuck, but they were broken. Power output spiked to 530 megawatts, but that still wasn't catastrophic yet. What was is that it kept going, and going, and going. The power continued to rise because nothing was holding back that reaction. The graphite wasn't causing the reaction to accelerate, but it wasn't doing anything to hold it back, and nothing was. There wasn't enough water. There were too many voids, and the water had been displaced and continued to be displaced as the rods continued to go down. But this hell happened in seconds, which is what the rods needed to get into the reactor in the first place. The power spike caused an increase in fuel temperature and therefore significantly more steam, resulting in an exceedingly high rise in steam pressure. Now, we've talked about a lot of steam locomotive explosions on this channel, so I don't think I need to explain to a lot of you why this is very, very bad. The fuel cladding failed, releasing fuel elements into the coolant and rupturing the channels in which those elements were located. And the final reading that's confirmed when it comes to the power output of this completely out of control nuclear reactor was 30,000 megawatts. Well in excess of what it was designed for, 10 times the amount, and it likely went even higher than that. It's unknown how high, but some estimates say it could have been even 10 more times 30,000. Like, the point is the power was outrageous. Horrifying doesn't even begin to describe it. followed was not a single explosion. Again, as is often portrayed, most assume that there was a single large explosion, and that's bad, which, yes, it is. However, no, there were actually at least two. The first being the steam. There was too much pressure. Explosive steam pressure ejected from the damaged fuel channels and escaped into the reactor's exterior cooling structure. This explosion of steam destroyed the casing on the reactor and tore off the upper biological shield. That particular explosion ruptured even more fuel channels, as well as severing all the remaining coolant lines. The remaining coolant that still wasn't steam flashed to steam and escaped the core, meaning there was a total water loss. And a second, more powerful explosion soon followed, just 2 to 3 seconds after the first. That explosion is what dispersed the damaged core and terminated the chain reaction. The spread of radioactive material was all over the place. It had thrown hot lumps of highly radioactive graphite on the ground surrounding the plant, on the roof, and upon exposure to the air, many bits caught fire. Radioactive fire. There are some other stories about the situation that was now in place. I'll address those as we go, but the first thing to cover is that one of the commonly accepted things about the reactor is that one man within the plant observed the control rods jumping up and down as things got more and more out of control. No, he didn't. He wasn't even in that area of the plant at the time, and even if he was, the design of an RBMK reactor makes such a thing completely impossible. They can't do that. That's not... no, that didn't happen. Nor was there a blue glow like a beam of light or a laser emanating from Chernobyl. The glow was more of a purplish red. It wasn't Cherenkov radiation. It was something else, but either way... Oh yeah, speaking of Bridge of Death, you probably heard of that, seen viral postings about it. Everyone stood on it, watched the glow that wasn't even there, and they all died. Yeah, not a thing. That didn't happen either. Didn't happen. Yep. Oh, people died, but not because they were standing on that bridge. There was a lot of death, but not there. Anyway, let's continue. It's still debated exactly what caused the second explosion, but regardless of that reasoning, it happened. It blew up, and that was horrible. It cannot be understated just how much really bad radiation, like ionizing radiation, like the stuff that will rip you apart without you even being aware it's happening until it's too late, all around the plant, into the atmosphere. Like this was quickly turning into a worst case scenario. It didn't help that the fire was still present and they had to kind of put that out somehow. And contrary to safety regulations, they had used bitumen in the construction of the roof, which is combustible. My American audience is probably like, what the heck is bitumen? It's asphalt. There was asphalt in the roof. Asphalt's great for roads. Don't put it in a roof. It'll catch fire. And it did. Because remember, there are other reactors here. It isn't just Reactor 4. There are 3 others. And ejected material ignited 5 fires on the roof of Reactor 3, which was still running. And Lord knows they didn't want another reactor to explode or suffer any kind of failure. So it was mission critical to put out the fires on Reactor 3's building to protect those cooling systems. Chief of the night shift of Reactor 3, Yuri Bagdasarov, actually wanted to shut down the reactor just to be safe, but the chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, told him no at first. The operators of Reactor 3 were told to remain at their posts and given respirators and potassium iodide tablets, but at 5 o'clock, Bagdasarov said the heck with it and shut down Reactor 3. That was also confirmed in writing by both Dyatlov and the station shift supervisor, Rogozkin. And the first thing they did was send in a bunch of unprotected firefighters to deal with the fire. That makes sense if the fires weren't radioactive. The fire brigade had not been briefed regarding the exact circumstances of the situation. Some of them thought that this was just a regular fire near a nuclear reactor, but not necessarily, immediately dangerous. Many of them, such as Vladimir Pravik, died within weeks of acute radiation sickness because It was a radioactive fire. The remains of the core were exposed. There was horrific death everywhere. Some firefighters said no one told them. They were just sent in. A few others did later say that they honestly did kind of suspect there was something sketchy going on. Those in the know regarding the operation of nuclear reactors did acknowledge the graphite and realize how serious things were, but they still did their jobs anyway. Anatoly Zakharov felt that despite the danger, it was his moral duty as a fireman to still go and help, even though he would likely die horribly. And many of them did. And they did manage to get the fires on the roof extinguished before succumbing to acute radiation sickness, vomiting and, your skin melting and horrible things were happening to them. What they couldn't necessarily put out was the fire inside of reactor number 4. That was burning, which is the critical problem, and actually putting it out proved to be highly difficult because of the heat involved. They couldn't just throw water on it because it would vaporize. So, instead, to deal with the problem, they used helicopters dropping more than 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, and, more intrinsically, neutron-absorbing boron. This would stop any reactivity and smother the fire out. Good idea, except, for one thing, the helicopters couldn't fly directly over the core, because that would mean the radiation would be directly in their faces, and, melt their faces. That's usually what happens. And the thing is, the helicopter thing, it's often assumed that worked. No, it didn't. They generally missed most of the time. They just couldn't drop it accurately. Many of the pilots didn't know what they were supposed to be aiming for because there was a glowing section, which is still unidentified, that was next to the actual core. And they kept trying to drop on that, and often missing, and not the core itself. In reality, the core went out on its own, just burned itself out. They didn't actually put it out directly. The problem with that, of course, is that it was left to burn for as long as it literally could, throwing ionizing radiation everywhere. Approximately 5.6 roentgens a second. That's equivalent to about 20,000 roentgens an hour? And to be clear, in terms of roentgens, a lethal dose is around 500. So, basically, if you stood near this thing for any amount of time, you're gonna die. In many areas, people did their work, their jobs, without any kind of protection. And part of the problem is that they didn't actually completely know how much radiation was coming out. They knew there was some, but they didn't have a high-level dosimeter. One that they had could measure up to 1,000, and another one they had failed when they turned it on. Like, immediately. 'Tis another faulty meter. You're wasting our time, comrade. Because of the lower readings, which were hilariously inaccurate, Akimov thought the reactor was still intact. It absolutely wasn't, but he thought that was the case. And despite the fact that they brought in another dosimeter by 4:30, which showed a much higher amount, they assumed it was defective. And they were ignoring the graphite and the reactor fuel and all the evidence that maybe you have a bigger problem here than you are realizing. Like, these guys were smart, but they may have been in a bit of denial or suffering the effects of acute radiation sickness. Like, Akimov himself stayed in the reactor building until morning, sending members of his crew to try to pump water into it. None of them were wearing any protective gear. Akimov and most of them died within just 3 weeks. But what about the surrounding area? The plant wasn't isolated. It wasn't just in the middle of nowhere. There was a city right next to it. Pripyat. And you might be saying, alright, well, the first thing to do is to get people evacuated, right? No! This is Soviet Russia, you fools! Don't be ridiculous. The townspeople weren't told of the accident during the night at all, and no evacuation was carried out at first. But within just a few hours, dozens of people began getting sick because, duh! And the plant wasn't run directly by the government in Ukraine. It was controlled by the Moscow authorities. And Moscow was kind of dragging their feet in terms of telling the Ukrainian government that, yeah, actually, this is really awful. Valentina Shevchenko was the chairwoman of the Presidium of Verkhovna Rada of the Ukrainian SSR. She would later say that the acting minister of their internal affairs, Vasil Durdanets, called her at work at 9 o'clock that morning to report current affairs. And at no time during the discussion until the very end did he mention to her the fire at Chernobyl. He then went on to tell her that it was extinguished and everything was fine. It's not that nothing about this is fine. Shevchenko asked him how the people were. Was everyone all right? Because that was part of her job. And Durdanet said there was nothing to be concerned about, comrade. Shevchenko would then speak by telephone to Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, and effectively their de facto head of state in that area. He told her that he expected a delegation of the State Commission that was headed by a man named Boris Sherbina to arrive soon. Sherbina was the deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR. He was in a pretty major position of power, though it's likely he didn't even understand the full extent of the disaster at the time. Later in the day, a commission was established to investigate the accident fully and was headed by a man named Valery Legasov. He was the first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, arriving at the power plant in the evening of April 26. By that point, 2 people were already dead and 52 were in the hospital. Now, Legasov is often viewed as a bit of a hero regarding the Chernobyl situation, but understand that part of it was actually his own fault. He had known about some of the flaws in the RBMK before, and it helped the state cover that up. He was a committed Communist Party man, which is why he was put in charge in the first place. That said, he did know what he was doing when it came to nuclear power. He was intelligent and well-educated. He did do what I would consider his best when it comes to dealing with what was a complete disaster. Very quickly, Legasov and those working with him obtained pretty substantial evidence that the reactor was completely destroyed, and that more alarmingly, there were exceedingly high levels of radiation just billowing out of what remained. It wasn't until the early morning of April 27th that they finally said, "Yo, we have got to get the people out of here," and they ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. It's relatively commonplace for many people to say the evacuation was botched, and that's not really true in the sense that the evacuation itself went pretty smoothly. They got plenty of people out. There were very few problems with that. It was that it was delayed. They should have evacuated immediately. They didn't. They waited long enough where plenty of people were already exposed. But once the evacuation happened, they got everyone out of there in just 3 days, which, wow, that does sound like a lot of time, and it was in this situation. To evacuate a whole city in the span of less than a week is actually pretty good. But of course, this is the Soviet Union, and they had to inject a bit of their Soviet misinformation into the situation. And by that I mean they told the residents to only bring what they absolutely needed, and that they would remain evacuated for just 3 days. They would be back very soon. So just take what you need for a little bit amount of time. You don't need a lot. It's no big deal, comrade. Obviously, none of these people would ever return to their homes because their homes became a horrific radioactive fallout hellscape. And the thing was, evacuating Pripyat proved not to be enough. The radiation kept spreading. Just the day after they began evacuating Pripyat, they started talking about evacuating people within a 10-kilometer zone around the disaster. And then 10 days after the accident, they expanded that to 30 kilometers. This would evolve into what's known as the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant Exclusion Zone, which hasn't always encompassed the same areas. It shifted a bit over time as things have been monitored and radiation levels tracked. But the point is, the zone is effectively a dead zone for people. You aren't supposed to be there, you aren't supposed to go there, and the reason is because you will die! And while they worked to contain things and make everything stable, get the situation under control, they were doing their best to not tell the capitalists about this. Please, nobody tell America about this. Or Europe, or really anyone. No one must know, comrades. Well, the thing about radiation is that you can't actually restrict it once it's in the atmosphere, at least not very easily. And those radioactive isotopes can be carried by the wind, in the smoke, and all over the place, And the radiation was so strong and traveled so far that it set off alarms at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden. That's 620 miles away. It set off the alarms in their plant. Naturally, the workers in the Sweden plant were a little concerned, but then quickly realized that the radiation wasn't coming from their own reactors, so they reported the case to the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority. It was quickly determined that the radiation was coming from somewhere else. It wasn't them, meaning that there was something going on, something sketchy. Hey! Guys! What are you doing? Nothing! Nothing! Everything is fine. Nothing is broken. Indeed, the Soviets, when first confronted by the Swedes, said that there was nothing wrong. Everything is great. There was no problem. No nuclear accident. Then what's with all the radiation? I don't know. Have you checked your own stuff? You know? Filthy capitalist stuff? Yeah? Yeah, maybe it's you? Everything about that? Well, Sweden didn't back down, and then they suggested to the Soviets that they were gonna file an official alert with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which would reveal the situation to absolutely everybody. And the Soviet Union at that point was like, oh god, alright, we may have had a small mishap, just a minor issue at Chernobyl. Yes, that might be a thing that happened, possibly. Indeed, they only conceded that this was a small issue, nothing major, everything's fine, no big deal, nobody panic. But, well, the eyes of the world were falling upon the Soviets. By that point in history, especially America, had gotten really good at spying on them. Like, we could see them from our satellites, everything they're doing. The French could do it too. Like, there were a lot of Western countries could just take pictures of them casually, and they knew it was Chernobyl, so they began examining the situation, and they realized that the Soviets had evacuated over 100,000 people, and you don't do that unless things are horrific. Within the Soviet Union, misinformation was also rampant as they tried to make sure no one realized that things were really that bad. In the evening of April 28th, a 20-second announcement was read on one of their TV news programs, known as Vremya. It said, "Comrades." Okay, they didn't say comrades, but I'm gonna say comrades. Comrades! There has been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the nuclear reactors was damaged. The effects of the accident are being remedied. Assistance has been provided for any affected people. An investigative commission has been set up. So basically they said nothing. That was a nothing burger of an announcement. Like, they said it happened, but they definitely downplayed it. And it was the first time they'd officially announced any kind of nuclear accident. They had some other issues, but nothing this major. They must have known that they couldn't keep this under wraps, even to their own people. And their news agencies proceeded to follow up the announcement of their own accident by discussing the 3 Mile Island accident over here in America. Really? Really? You're gonna make this... Really? Okay, understand that 3 Mile Island was a problem, but it was pretty well contained. Like, it, for example, it didn't result in an exclusion zone that remains to this day. Like, we managed our accident pretty well, all things considered, with minimal radiation getting out, no one hurt to any significant degree. Like, one of these things is not like the other. You guys shut up. The international politics and criticism surrounding Chernobyl in terms of the Cold War, I could talk about that all day, because, yo, things got messy. But let's focus back on the actual disaster, because there was more stuff they had to do to contain this. They couldn't just leave it open like that. The fire was out, but there was still a problem. We still have a lot of radioactive substances just kicking around here. What are we gonna do? Well, there were several things they did do in order to mitigate things. Mostly because the core had gotten so hot that it had melted down. It wasn't just the explosion, it had suffered a meltdown. And more intrinsically, 2 floors of bubbler pools existed beneath the reactor. Those served as a large water reservoir for the emergency cooling pumps. They also act as a pressure suppression system capable of condensing steam in case of a small broken steam pipe or something. Nothing like this major thing that was going on. Above the bubbler pools was a third floor, just below the reactor, that served as a steam tunnel. The steam released by a broken pipe was supposed to enter the steam tunnel and then be led into the bubbler pools through a layer of water. But after the disaster, those pools, as well as the basement, were flooded because of the ruptured pipes and water that had simply built up from the firefighters. Because of the meltdown, things were melting down, literally. Smoldering graphite, fuel, and other radioactive material was just chilling there at 1,200 degrees Celsius, 2,190 degrees Fahrenheit, and that began to burn and melt through the reactor floor and mix with molten concrete from the lining, creating a substance that's called corium. It's often compared to something like lava and has a similar consistency, except it is hilariously radioactive, as you can imagine. Spicy lava. As if regular lava wasn't spicy enough. The concern was that the melted mixture of all this radioactive crap could melt through the floor and reach the water, which would result in a pretty immediate and insane production of steam that could cause another explosion or further contaminate the area, meaning they felt they had to drain the pool. Now, in retrospect, it actually was never a problem. The thing was, the corium moved very slowly, and even though it did melt down towards the water, it dripped slowly into the flooded bubbler pools. Because of this slow dripping, it didn't flash everything into steam all at once. It wasn't this immediate, explosive response, just slow and limited. So there was never actually a risk of a secondary catastrophe here, but they were operating with what they knew. And the point was that this could have happened as far as they were concerned, so they still felt the need to drain the water. The commission directed the bubbler pools be drained by opening the sluice gates, but the valves for controlling those gates were located in a flooded corridor in some subterranean tunnels next to the reactor building. This was of course a major concern because it was believed the water was very radioactive, and anyone who went down there could reach the valves and open them, but would likely die as a result. 3 men who were braver than I for what was effectively a suicide mission: Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespolov, and a shift supervisor, Boris Baranov. They were successful. They opened the sluice gates, and still, even now, people report and say that all 3 died just days after their mission. No, they didn't. They all survived, yeah. The reason for this is that the water that they were going through wasn't nearly as radioactive as people expected, which was fortunate for them because they didn't hit a lethal dose. But they didn't know that. Nobody knew it. They all expected death and still did their duty anyway, and were awarded the Order for Courage in May of 2018. With the sluice gates open, the fire brigade pumps were used to drain the basement, removing all the water from it. But there was also concern with the foundation. It was thought that the molten core could burn into the earth underneath the building in general and then contaminate groundwater. And the first plan to contain this was ridiculous, frankly. They decided they were gonna freeze the earth. Comrades, we will utilize the power of the Siberian tundra. They used oil well drilling equipment and injected liquid nitrogen, starting on May 4th, in order to freeze the ground underneath and prevent the meltdown from reaching the groundwater. But the problem with this is that the tremendous amount of liquid nitrogen it took to accomplish this, 25 tons a day, basically, this was, insanely creative and kind of awesome in its way, wasn't sustainable. There was no way they were going to be able to keep that up. So that idea was abandoned, and instead they had subway builders and coal miners excavate a tunnel below the reactor to make room for what was basically a giant heat sink, a cooling system. It would use a coiled formation of pipes that were cooled with water and covered on top with a thin, thermally conductive graphite layer. The graphite layer would prevent the concrete above from melting. That layer of graphite was sandwiched between 2 other layers of concrete, each a meter thick, to stabilize it. And the design was pretty novel. It's very similar to what are called core catchers, which is a safety device attached to a lot of modern nuclear reactors. It's put below them and designed to catch corium in the case of a nuclear meltdown. and prevented from doing exactly what the Commission was afraid that Chernobyl was about to do. However, this proved to be unnecessary. The men who dug the tunnel did their job and finished, but there was no cooling system ever installed because they just didn't have to. The reason is that atmospheric temperature, just the weather in general, had gotten a lot colder, and that had helped stop the meltdown. The corium would come to rest at ground level, but not penetrate into it. Thus, they didn't install the cooling device, but they did fill the tunnel with concrete to strengthen the foundation below the reactor and make absolutely 100% sure that it would stay where it was. Once the potential secondary explosions or disasters were averted, attention would turn to cleanup. This went on for months, and the big problem was that plenty of radioactive debris remained on the roof of the reactor building. And by this point, they had planned to build what was known as the Sarcophagus around Reactor 4 to contain everything. The big problem with this is that removing the debris from the roofs was incredibly dangerous. It was radioactive, you couldn't go near it. At least not safely. They tried to use some robots in order to accomplish this, and employed roughly 60 remote-controlled robots. But they had very limited success. They weren't as dexterous as they needed to be, the terrain was difficult for them to navigate, and many failed because of the radiation. You can't just throw complex electronics next to radiation. It shreds that too. So instead, they utilized bio-robots. People. They sent soldiers in, with as much protective gear as they could give them, and removed the debris from the roof. Because extended exposure would kill them, they would work between 40 and 90 seconds before they went back to cover again. This tedious process was repeated consistently until all the debris was removed. A total of 3,828 men were involved in this procedure, and received an average dose of 250 millisieverts of radiation each. Moving forward, for full containment, they had to erect what was known as the Sarcophagus, a large steel and concrete shelter that had to be built quite quickly because, obviously, constructing around there was dangerous, and the design work started on May 20th, 1986, just 24 days after the explosion. Construction took place between June and November of that year, and all the workers involved had to be protected from the radiation, and there were new techniques employed in order to minimize risk. Those that worked in the cranes, for example, worked in lead-lined control cabins. In the end, they did finish, safely containing the major factor, but there was still plenty of contamination around. During the construction of the sarcophagus, they did take the opportunity to examine the remains of the reactor more closely. They discovered a lot of radiation because, duh. Some of the scientists that went in manually collected the cold fuel rods, which was a really bad friggin' idea, and they also discovered what was known as the elephant's foot. It was a 2-meter wide mass of radioactive material, melted sand, concrete from the floors, and corium. Due to the radioactive decay, the elephant's foot was still very hot at the time, and especially lethal. They couldn't get anywhere near it back then. And viral news media continuously says it's still hilariously dangerous and still melting down, but that's not true. These days, the radioactive decay has come to a pretty reasonable amount. The temperature of the elephant's foot is no longer that much above room temperature. You can touch it without burning yourself. I still wouldn't do that, by the way, and it's still relatively radioactive, just so we're clear, but it's not melting down, and is starting to break up and fall apart. The cleanup that was done around the plant took 7 months. And to be frank, they probably should have waited a bit before doing this after the evacuation, because a lot of the most dangerous isotopes would actually naturally decay relatively fast, bringing the radiation, well, not low, but lower than it would otherwise be. But instead, the Soviets thought that if they cleaned up now, they could repopulate the place and start cultivating the land again sometime soon. Some of the areas were resettled. Within 15 months, a lot of it was under cultivation again, and a third of the evacuated villages were safely resettled, deemed safe for human habitation. But a lot of the equipment used for cleaning up the most highly effective areas had to be abandoned because it itself became ridiculously radioactive. Vehicles in particular were buried and some just straight up left. Incredibly, while they no longer planned to build any more reactors at the site, the remaining 3 reactors were allowed to stay running for some years after the disaster. Reactor number 2 was shut down in October of 1991 after a fire occurred in the turbine building. It didn't result in anything catastrophic, but it was declared damaged beyond repair. Reactor number 1 was decommissioned in '96 as part of a deal between the Ukrainian government and international organizations to end operations at the plant, and in 2000, the then president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, personally turned off reactor number 3. But the confinement of Reactor 4, who's still in timeout forever, because you were naughty, has required continuous monitoring, because the sarcophagus was constructed very, very, very quickly, because they had to, and it was never intended to last particularly long. They estimated the time the lifespan was about 30 years, but in February of 2013, a part of the roof of the turbine building next to the sarcophagus collapsed as a result of natural decay of being just left there. An examination was conducted of the sarcophagus itself, and the engineers reported that it was also going to fall apart, and that would result in more radiation being released. It had to stay there. But they'd already known that that might be a problem. And they started construction of what was called the new Safe Confinement structure over top of the existing sarcophagus back in 2010. This new, much more well-built structure was finished in 2016 and has a lot of modern features. Not only is it designed much better and built to last, but it's also built in such a way as to allow the reactor to be safely dismantled using remotely operated equipment, so, we don't have to expose anyone else to horrific levels of invisible death. And I could go on and on. There's so much complexity surrounding the disaster. But regarding the area, which is still considered an exclusion zone, well, it has recovered in some ways. People still don't live in the places with the higher amount of radiation, but levels are low enough that a lot of animals have moved back into the area, and their populations are doing fairly well. They do still have to deal with the radiation, but it's been shown that many of the species, like the wolves, have cancer-resistant genes as part of their genome, which is pretty interesting to see. There are many lies about the state of animals within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Years ago, a 3-eyed fish was found, and many news outlets reported that it was found near Chernobyl. Now, that fish was found near another nuclear plant that wasn't suffering a leak, and a 3-eyed fish isn't something that hasn't been found before. And given there was no radiation leak, it was just a coincidence that it was found near there. But naturally, news media latched onto it because, gotta get those clicks. Also, there's the footage of the headless moose that apparently someone saw in the Chernobyl area. That is an edit. That is footage of an actual moose with a regular head that someone simply edited the head out of because clicks. Again, And more recently, I even saw a post about the blue dogs. It's a very recent development. Apparently some of the dog packs that live in Chernobyl are turning blue, and this is because of all the radiation, the mutations, my god! No, that had nothing to do with it. They're not even naturally blue. Some claim this was AI. It isn't AI, but it had nothing to do with the radiation. Researchers who looked further into this realized they were actually coated in some kind of substance, probably from an old portable toilet, as a cleaning agent or something like that, and it was simply coated on their fur. That's all it was. As for other stories of mutants, well, we can go on and on and on. Some people say they were radioactive, evil zombie mutants. Oh god, we played Stalker and think we know everything. There's so much nonsense about the exclusion zone. In truth, today it's, while dangerous, relatively stable and peaceful. The animals live without fear of humans because we don't really go there. There are some tourists that go to the safer areas, and as far as mutant fish, well, the catfish in Chernobyl are massive, but probably because they aren't being hunted. There have been observed some mutations, but the thing about mutations when it comes to radiation is that generally the mutations are pretty lethal, immediately. Many animals wouldn't live long enough because the mutations caused or Look, radiation rips your cells apart. It doesn't turn you into a superhero, guys, or even make you all that cool or interesting. It usually just kills you. So yeah, while some minor mutations have been seen here and there, the point is, it's not nearly as, well, science fiction as you might be expecting. But Chernobyl as a disaster is a case of so many factors going into it, just so many problems. So many things that went wrong and could have been avoided. They should never have attempted that test under the situation that they were in. That was obviously a mistake. And as for who was punished, well, to be fair, most of the workers, were dead. Dyatlov survived. He did suffer from radiation sickness, but he lived. And he was scapegoated hard for what happened, but it really wasn't his fault. At least not him solely. It had to do with a lot of policies and a systemic failure when it came to nuclear power in the Soviet Union. For example, one of the things that could have mitigated things quite a lot was having a protective dome around the reactor. You'll notice that here in America, and in most other places, when we build nuclear reactors, we build a protective solid layer around the actual reactor building in case of an explosion, for example. The Soviets didn't bother with that. That alone would have reduced the damage significantly. In 1987, a criminal trial was held to sentence those involved with the disaster. Viktor Bryukhanov was the plant director and was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp for gross violations of safety regulations that led to the explosion. He served 5 years. Dyatlov was sentenced to 10 years in prison and was released very early due to health concerns in 1990. He would die in 1995. Nikolai Fomin, the chief engineer, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Boris Rogozin, the shift director of Reactor 4, received a 5-year sentence. Alexander Kovalenko, the chief of Reactor 4, was sentenced to 3 years. And Yuri Loshkin, the inspector from the State Committee on Atomic Energy, received 2 years. Those were the consequences, though many point out that the Soviet Union itself would stop being a thing in a very short amount of time later. Disaster was held mostly against them because of the systemic failings. As I said, Dyatlov in particular was held as a scapegoat, and most of those sentenced were just scapegoats, someone to blame, when in reality it was the working culture and the policies in place that allowed for this to happen, and that was Moscow's fault. Fortunately, since that time, no nuclear disaster has come close to being like Chernobyl was. True, Japan did have to deal with Fukushima, but in their defense, that was due to a tsunami. Someday, perhaps even in our lifetimes, maybe people might be able to live in the exclusion zone again. Maybe there won't be an exclusion zone. But the thing about nuclear energy is this. It's very useful, very impressive. It's very clean. You can produce so much power without any carbon emissions. There's no pollution to the atmosphere with nuclear power. True, you have to deal with the spent nuclear fuel, that's a problem. But there's no immediate emissions. And you can get a lot of power very quickly and cleanly. But you have to respect it. You have to respect what you're dealing with. Because in the wrong hands, with the wrong policies, things can go wrong. And when they go wrong with nuclear power, they can go really wrong, resulting in consequences lasting decades. And I bet you're wondering, what about the death toll? Why haven't I discussed that? Well, the truth is, we don't know. Immediate deaths surrounding the accident were relatively minimal. 31 people would die from the immediate disaster. But in terms of the lingering effects, it's impossible to determine. There are many different estimates, some in the thousands, some in the tens of thousands, regarding the effects of the radiation and how much it hurt people. A major UN report suggested roughly 4,000 premature deaths from cancer, for example, but that number is really impossible to know for certain. It could be higher, it could be lower. The fact is, radiation is something that is, well, invisible, and its effects aren't always obvious. Many people who were being evacuated, too late, for example, were exposed, and a lot of them might have developed cancers that can't be directly, definitively attributed to that exposure, but might have been. If it helps give you any reassurance, modern studies have shown that long-term health effects weren't as severe as initially feared, but it was still completely avoidable. And I think that's the big thing here. Like, you guys didn't have to let this happen. There were so many ways to avoid it. And there's one final myth I would like to bust real quick. Some have argued that if they hadn't pressed AZ5 when they did, the reactor wouldn't have exploded. This isn't true. Sorry, scratch that. It definitely would have made the accident far less horrific, and there may not have been a straight-up explosion in the manner that it had occurred. But the reactor was already wildly unstable, and it would have gotten out of control no matter what they did. It just would have done it a lot more slowly, and it likely would have resulted in far less catastrophic damage than what actually happened. So no, not pressing the Scram wouldn't have prevented catastrophe. But it would have made it less severe, probably. You know, it's one of those things. Anyway, this was long. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.